And Lord Skidelsky, just thinking about the response throughout the Commonwealth, I mean, Hong Kong was also quite unusual in the sense that the response in Hong Kong to her party was so warm. I mean, we had sort of murmurs in Kenya, in many other places, where people, I think their feelings towards the monarchy were far more complicated. Is that correct? And do you have any sort of particular insight into why that may be?
Well, my insight when listening to the discussion is we're all wallowing in nostalgia, and it's really the future. And the future is that what's the future of the British connection? I mean, there are two possible futures. One is the legacy of British rule. It may influence, to some extent, how the mainland China. I mean, there may be a legacy of some kind there. And the second legacy is the future of Hong Kongers in Britain. I mean, that's coming to be the more important connection. I mean, how will Hong Kongers who have overseas British passports be received in this country? How will they respond to the British life, its opportunities and challenges? And I mean, that's where the future of the British connection lies, and that is where the future of Hong Kong's relationship to the monarchy will mainly lie, because they'll be part of a British family not located where Hong Kong is located. Because where Hong Kong is located, it had no independent future. It had no autonomous future. It couldn't have. And that was also always a window ledge hanging over its head for 50 years and then another 50 years following that. So I don't think we should concentrate so much on what the Queen meant in the past, but think about what the British connection might mean in the future. That's my personal point.
Well, I think that's a very good contribution, to really sort of look ahead and.
I've said what I wanted. Others might.
But I mean, I think if we think of the Queen really as a symbol of the past, as I think Steve has outlined as well, that perhaps it was a past we sort of remember with a degree of fondness, even though that's not to deny that there were certainly black periods during that past as well. Could it also be sort of argued that she represented the way Hong Kongers now are looking at their past? Because I think a lot of the concerns for many of the people who have moved to the UK from Hong Kong has been how we are remembering or how we are being taught about our past. And perhaps for us the Queen represents a less politicised construction of a past that perhaps was more innocent, a past where, again, we are allowed to remember Hong Kong as it was. What do you think, Chip?
We from Hong Kong do not need to be apologetic to other peoples in other former colonies who claim, well, these are facts, right, that the British Empire, represented by the monarchy, had committed some atrocities. I mean, for example, in Kenya, we all know that 2 years after the coronation, right, of Queen Elizabeth II, there was this Mau Mau rebellion, brutally crushed by the British army there, and what happened in India and in other colonies as well. Right? But these atrocities have never happened in Hong Kong. It doesn't mean that we are being selfish, right? But we are only what we were. I mean, drawing a comparison with Mr. Deng Xiaoping, many Wall Street bankers, if you work for Morgan Stanley, would think that Deng Xiaoping has been a great leader because he has persisted in opening the door to the West to business investment or whatever after the Tiananmen massacre. But if you ask any mother or parents who lost their child on the 4th of June in Tiananmen by the PLA, ordered personally by Deng Xiaoping into the place, right? And they would have a different story of their perception about Deng Xiaoping. So, right, could these Tiananmen parents who lost their children accuse, right, the Wall Street bankers who have benefited from the open door policy designed by Deng Xiaoping of being heartless, ruthless, right, cold-blooded, murderer defenders? Well, it's the same, right? To put it in a more crude metaphor, if you go into a casino and sit down on a blackjack table, right? I win the money from the same dealer because I have good cards, right? All the nights. But the one who sit next to me keep losing, and he or she, because of getting all the bad cards all the night, the whole night, would be cursing the dealer. But no, I would give her a hug and kiss her because I won so much money. She gave me good luck. That's it. That's the way of the world. Right? So I mean, many people might not feel happy to hear about this analogy. So we do not need to be apologetic. Yes, we all know the British Empire has done this or that in Kenya, Rhodesia, or whatever in India. It would be helpful and useful for us to read more contemporary history book, knowing more about the British Empire, especially represented by this group. But it doesn't mean that we have to get emotional, because we were born in Hong Kong, and unfortunately, our perception or knowledge about the Queen were framed up by that tiny horizon called Victoria Harbour, and we have been having a good life. I mean, she represented what you may call the lesser of the two evils, at the most, and that's it. But when you present your argument, say to a factory co-worker, in Luton or Leicester, you need to be a little bit careful. That's it.
I don't know what Chip's got against Luton. I live near there.
So Steve, maybe if I could just sort of again narrow it down. Now, I think the point I was trying to sort of make was, does the Queen in a way sort of represent a connection with a history? Because history has become something that I think is important for many Hong Kongers, the way we remember history. And has the Queen come to represent a more sort of innocent time when we were able to engage with the history that we remembered, a less politicized history? Do you think there's some validity in that?
Well, I think it's an illusion, Why did literally hundreds of thousands and then millions of people come across to Hong Kong? It was because of history, it was because of politics. I don't think people willingly want to leave their homeland. I mean, I certainly wasn't keen to leave Hong Kong, and I doubt anybody here says, oh great, we can leave Hong Kong. There's a reason why people take this drastic step of going from one place to another, and it is usually because they're forced to do so. Some people go because there are better opportunities, but the fact of the matter is Hong Kong's great growth of population was spurred by the devastation of the Great Famine, the devastation of the Cultural Revolution, and the general poverty that was created by the disastrous policies of the communist regime in the Great Leap Forward and what have you. So I think the fact of the matter is that politics has always, people perhaps didn't explicitly look at it in those terms, but politics has always shaped Hong Kong's future. The big thing though is that Hong Kong was playing the passive role in the politics. It wasn't playing the active role. And what changed in the 1980s, but obviously much more in the 1990s, is you had a generation of people who said, we want to have a role in making our future. We no longer accept that we'll just wait for events to overtake us. I mean, this is, you have the first generation in the late 1980s where the majority of people in Hong Kong were actually born in Hong Kong as opposed to in the mainland. And I think that people say, politics has ruined everything in Hong Kong. This is just complete and utter nonsense. Politics created Hong Kong as it has created every single society in the world. But what happened is that Hong Kong people took the idea that they weren't just going to be victims of what happened, but they were going to play a role in making something else happen. So that, although the results of that have been absolutely disastrous, I mean, I don't think anybody seriously suggests that the current situation in Hong Kong represents any kind of progress. What has happened in Hong Kong has laid the seeds. If these people who run Hong Kong today think that they will rule forever, they've never read a history book, and I'm very convinced of that.
So we've got...
history. Could I make a point about history? It's very, very interesting, this, to me. First of all, I was in Hong Kong in 1967, and so I lived through all of that. From very, very close quarters. And what was the difference? I mean, this was the pre-1970s, 80s Hong Kong, pre-1980s Hong Kong. What they were demonstrating against was the British colonial regime. It was a left-wing demonstration. But it was parallel to lots of things going on in Europe and the United States. If you like, the last gasp for the left. And it was trade union-led, and the British handled it very, very carefully. But there were large demonstrations. It was quite violent. People were making bombs. And there were, 50 or 100 killed altogether. So it was a large event. Now, the ones since 2014, 15, 16, have been very different, and they've been directed against a different target. So, what was the change in that? Is it just that left-wing causes have lost their interest for young people? The revelation of the atrocities and totalitarian methods of countries like China are now too clear. But they were also clear in 1967. I mean, we were in the height of Mao's Cultural Revolution. There was very, very violent events going on in China at that time, as well as mass starvation. Why did people still demonstrate in favour of joining Hong Kong, joining the People's Republic of China then? So I'm interested in historical shifts of mood. Is it a generational thing, or what? But all I know is that, to me, Hong Kongers have always been politically active and involved. They haven't been passive in the way that Chinese people are sometimes depicted as being only interested in personal enrichment or something. There's been this activist strand, and I saw it when I was there in the 1960s as well. Very angry people got, and they wanted to do something. They were idealists.
So we've got 10 minutes. I'd like to invite the floor to put their questions to the panel. So anyone got some questions?
I have a question for Lord Skidelsky, which is, as you yourself is an economic historian, so from your perspective, what do you think were the connection and the interplay of the Queen, the British Empire, and Hong Kong? Thank you.
So, Lord Skidelsky, did you hear the question?
Could you just repeat that question for
Yes,
me?
the question was the interplay between the Queen, the British Empire, and Hong Kong.
Yeah.
So, as an economic historian,
I don't think there was a very complicated interplay there. Basically, there was a colonial regime, and the colonial regime had some oppressive features, but basically it gave people in Hong Kong a guaranteed existence and promise of a better future. Now, I think that was the main plot. I don't think the Queen, there's no more, it was no more central to that than the Queen was to the British welfare state, if you like. She was a symbol of something, but she wasn't the guarantor of it. It wasn't, people didn't, I think, say, we're going to get all these benefits of colonial rule because the Queen is behind it. I'm not sure people thought in that way. I'd be very surprised anyway if they did.
have we got any other questions?
To respond to what the Lord just said, why were people in 1967 want to embrace a red and radical China? I think it was a pandemic at that time, as much as the pandemic of the cancel culture today, when people got a bit blind, and it was those radicals who were brainwashed. And secondly, the Chinese propaganda campaign had been very successful, and they were blaming the poverty in the Hong Kong colony on entirely the colonial government, but without pointing out the fact that there were only about 1 million population in Hong Kong in 1949. And then within a short span of time of less than 2 decades, the population became 3 million or even or nearly 4 because of the mass number of refugees crossing the border away from the people's commune with Great Leap Forward, etc. And the British government at that time was very poor. We all remember after the Second World War, John Keynes had to cross the Atlantic to beg from the American government for loan, right? And British people, as late as in 1956, correctly if I'm wrong, had to queue up for rationed bacon and eggs in the market. So the British government in London had no money to look after the poor in Hong Kong. It was very poor social welfare system. But the expansion of the refugee population was due to the what happened in China. So you had hills after hills of wooden huts and sheds. People were, really in very bad living condition. And that time there was this propaganda in cinema and newspaper blaming such poverty on capitalism and colonialism, so that some young people in those days were under the impression that the poor people were exploited by what they vaguely perceived to be the American imperialism and the colonial government, and especially seeing someone like Sir Ho Tung, right, and his family having a luxury life at the peak, right? So people at that time were a little bit simple-minded, and so are some today. Given the romanticism readily embraced by any young generation, and of course you have that global climate of the May 1968 in Paris, and John Lennon and Bob Dylan and the kind of anti-Vietnam War, you know, in American campus. So it became a pandemic. It was it looked rather cool to join that opposition, right? Even if you didn't belong to the communist camp. I remember as late as in the early 1970s, there were some radical magazines and publications, you know, calling for Hong Kong, either Hong Kong independence or immediate occupation of Hong Kong by the PLA, etc. Of course, these voices were rather marginalized. I mean, as late as in 1975, when the Queen made her first visit to Hong Kong, there was this magazine called the 1970s. Not the one that edited by the late Li Yi, but a minority of radical local Marxists, a little bit bizarre, publishing a cartoon of the Queen, you know, caricature of the Queen, you know, on the cover with a tiny Chinese character, you know, of the word fuck, right? So it was, despite all this, you know, the magazine was on sale on newspaper stand, although it was rumored that they were after the special branch became concerned and went after them. And some of them became legislative council a few years later.
And if I could just move the conversation on and maybe invite Steve to comment on this. I mean, I think one of the big differences that we saw in 1967, I mean, the 67 riots, it's no big secret. I mean, Julie Lovell's written a wonderful, done some wonderful work on this. Was of course that there was another power that was actively stoking what was happening in Hong Kong, not only in Hong Kong, but in a lot of sort of revolutions around the world at that time. I think for many Hong Kongers, when we look at the way the colonial government, I don't have a very sort of pink view of Murray MacLehose and all the reforms he put in, but it's very striking that the colonial government chose to respond to the disturbances in '67 in a very, very different way to our current administration. Steve, could you perhaps sort of comment on that?
Well, I think that's very interesting. Can I just before that, I think we should remember these riots in the 1960s were a minority of the population. Nothing like the movement in 2019, nothing like 2 million people on the streets of Hong Kong. But the response is interesting. There's always two ways you can go after a big amount of social upheaval. You either go down the dictatorship route, the Chinese route, which is to put everyone in jail, is to rampage through the system, destroying civil society, or, and for all its faults, the Brits, I think, did the right thing, or you say, there was a reason for this, and perhaps we ought to address it. So what the Brits did was develop the big public housing system that hadn't existed before, was to put in place some kind of rudimentary social security system so that the very poor people in Hong Kong got at least something, still remain very poor incidentally, and they put money into schools as well. Remember, the size of classrooms in the 1960s were enormous, ridiculously large. So money went into education. So, there's the enlightened approach, or there's the instinctive approach of dictators. The instinctive approach of dictators is, if anybody challenges you, hit them on the head. The approach of these colonial administrators, and remember, they weren't elected by anybody, but the important thing was that behind them was an elective system of government. And they did actually live in fear that questions would be asked, as they were incidentally in London, about what they were doing. And they had to think more carefully, rather than destroying Hong Kong society, as to ways in which it could be improved. So I share with Evan the ambivalence about Murray MacLehose, but you know, some of the things that he put in place in that very tense period were of very substantial importance, I think, to Hong Kong.
Well, anyway, unfortunately we're out of time, but could you join me in thanking our panellists, Lord Skidelsky, Stephen Vines and Chip Tsao.